This is Roger Bolton, and I'm here to interview Richard Edelman for the Oral History Series at the Page Center at Penn State University. Richard, you're the CEO of Edelman Public Relations, a firm founded by your father when?
1952.
And what was the world like when he founded this firm, and what was he thinking when it began?
He had the idea that marketing public relations was really the potential larger force even than corporate or public affairs, and he felt that the so-called independent validation by credible third parties would be very important in the marketing process, and ultimately he's been proven very right. His really big idea was the media tour, and he did it for the Tony Company, in which Twin has the Tony, and he toured the Twins, and then he did it for Sara Lee and Lemon and Kentucky Fried Chicken and California Wines, and he was off to the races. But it was an incredibly different time, Roger, because relatively few media, national media in particular, a lot of local media, and it was a time of very high trust in institutions, and it was President Eisenhower, after all. Everything was good and normal, and and also PR people were called publicists, so it wasn't exactly the way in which we're regarded now. So my dad used to have parties of 300 journalists from the Chicago Media Corps at our home, and growing up we would crawl between the legs of the celebrating tipsy reporters.
So
different time.
The firm has changed, the world has changed.
Yeah.
Think about the world in 1952 when your dad founded the firm, and the world today. How would you characterize the difference in the environment in which Edelman operates?
Well, I think first point is advertising was so by far the dominant force in communications, and I don't think that's true anymore. I think that we're absolutely at the table and arguably have a more substantial relationship with senior management than advertising. Advertising is a functional, tactical skill, and public relations is a strategic and counseling as well as execution. And so, the way I describe it is moving from the sort of tail of the dog to the brain of the dog. Also, you've had the evolution of media in such a substantial way with the dispersion of authority into social media, into companies with so-called owned media with their own channel on YouTube or whatever. You clearly also have very important blogs that like Politico or TechCrunch or TechMeme that are setting the agenda, and that's a big change. And then the last is sort of this emergence of civil society, the rise of NGOs, really in the last decade. And when you see this from the Edelman Trust Barometer, where NGOs are now much more trusted than either business or government, they've sort of sponged up the loss of trust in those two mainstream institutions. And they're really the fifth estate in global governance. So, it's business with civil society now, and it's not just in opposition to.
Well, one of the issues clearly is that government hasn't really earned the trust either. And so all institutions seem to be suffering from a lack of trust. Is that accurate?
Yes, I think you see a general malaise about trust. That's correct.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting dichotomy between the rising markets of China, India, where everything is great. Mm-hmm. We love government, we love business, mm-hmm. we love CEOs, mm-hmm. whereas in the West, mm-hmm. It's not the case, just the opposite. Mm-hmm. We don't like government. Mr. Sarkozy is 25% popular, Obama's mm-hmm. now at 40%. And we don't like CEOs, we only trust 25% of them. Mm-hmm. That's pretty bad. Mm-hmm. So that's a long, slow climb back out of the abyss. 2008 September was a big moment And it wasn't just the demise of Lehman Brothers.
No.
It was the demise of centerpiece companies in the world economy and destruction of pension funds and decline of sovereign nations, Greece needing a bailout. All these are just almost unthinkable, but they've happened.
Yeah.
And so then people have to say, well, what are my basic assumptions? Who do I trust? Well, I trust experts. I trust employees within the company. I don't trust the CEO. I have to hear things 5 times before I get to belief, not once. It's not the age of Uncle Walter Cronkite. That's over. I get news from 8 sources a day, not 2. And so we're going to have to do surround sound and agility and speed, and but a basic reordering of priorities, I think, for business.
Represents opportunity, though, does it not? In the sense that there is a long way to go upwards, but there's an opportunity to go there.
I think companies that recognize that opportunity and are not afraid of letting go a little. So I see this dichotomy between control and credibility.
Yeah.
And the more you control, the less you're believed. And so, but it's scary. I'm sure the first time you skied really fast on a hill, you said, I'm out of control. And your ski instructor said, come on, Roger, keep doing that because you're actually more safe than if you try to lean back into the hill. That's about the best analogy I can make. And having fallen many times because I was nervous. You can't be nervous. And even if you make a mistake, you just have to get up and say, I got to ski to the bottom of the hill, otherwise I'm going to walk. So, you don't have that option really, unless you want to be laughed at.
And many business leaders aren't prepared to cede control in that way, or don't have the understanding of the trends or the background to be able to trust the letting go as a way of building trust.
I think that they're starting to see object lessons in the success of that letting go, and letting the middle part of the company speak up. And a company that historically you would have thought of as highly controlled, Microsoft, they have, I think, 20,000 people blogging one way and another. It's a huge change maker for them and allows a discussion as opposed to a talk at. And I think there's genius in that. And similarly, you see a change in mentality at a GE or a Walmart. And as icons do it, people at others say, well, maybe we should be doing the same. And then also, certain brands, Ben & Jerry's ice cream, for which we do work, they've really led in social media. They had, I don't know, a couple 100,000 friends on Facebook. They did a contest where they said, please, crowd, tell us which flavors, here are ingredients you can play with, make it on your home stove, come back to us, we'll commercialize it if it works. They jumped to 1 million friends on Facebook within 6 weeks. And they commercialized one of the products, and it's become a big seller. And the point is, involve people with your brand. And they had an advantage, right? Because they had a history of eco and
right.
Sourcing appropriately, but they've changed their mentality completely.
This is the people like me phenomenon?
Yes.
Do you want to explain that?
Sure. Well, we found, starting 4 or 5 years ago, that a person like yourself is a very important source of credible information. So, you and I both like theater. If I were, thinking about, whether to go to a Shakespeare festival, I'd definitely send you an email, much more than rely upon local media or other, because I know because you've lived your life in it. So that's what has evidenced itself, in a sense, in Facebook, where a sort of peer recommendation leads to 6 times more likely to buy than if it was just a ad on Facebook.
With major impact, obviously, on the established media, how do you see the media environment changing? You mentioned a few minutes ago the surround sound, or the need to hear it from multiple sources.
Yeah.
People don't just rely on Walter Cronkite or the one
Right.
trusted source. So there's a proliferation of media outlets, and yet, at the same time, perhaps still a need for media to establish credibility and trust as well.
Sure.
Yes?
Well, I think they're going to establish credibility and trust differently,
Mm-hmm.
which is to say they're going to be much more immediate. On a continuum, you have reporters blogging. They'll write short form copy that might go up on wire service, and then they'll have the long form piece that will show up the next morning. But again, it's the continuum. And interestingly, it's as much about the blog post and the subsequent conversation as it is the long form piece that then yields letters to the editor.
Mm-hmm.
So actually, I think the reaction by mainstream media has also been to open up their walled gardens. So if you think about the WashingtonPost.com, they have decided that they're no longer going to have a front page mentality, which is to say, Roger's going to read a little bit of foreign news and a little bit of local news and a little bit of, domestic tax legislation. Maybe Roger's just interested in domestic politics. And so we're going to have Washington Post, domesticpolitics.com. And then we're also going to aggregate best of, even from Politico or from AP, because narrow and deep is what we have to offer. So I think that's a profound change for media. I think the unresolved question is whether they're going to be able to have a advertising supported only model, or whether they're going to have a model that charges for content. And if so, how? Do I charge, as the Wall Street Journal does, an annual fee of $100 for access? Do I have a tiered play where I could write to Bob Woodward at the Washington Post if I had a real question about Iran if I pay $500 a year? And that's possible. But what's the impact on the PR firm is the real issue. And
Right.
I think we've got to become much more quick. We've got to have much more visual content, not just written. We've got to go where the conversations are, meaning we've got to put up an embassy for our clients on a Facebook, if in fact that's where the locus of conversation is. We can't just rely on people to go to NewYorkTimes.com because that's where the article is. No way. And I also think we've got to do a better job of identifying who the true influencers are, as opposed to just the amplifiers. A person, Austin Kutcher, has 1 million followers on Twitter. Does not make him an influencer, because he's probably not a thought starter. He might be on certain subjects, might be on eco, for example, but on use of a tech product, not so sure. Maybe a gearhead in Silicon Valley who's got a very interesting view, but we've got to identify them, work to reach them, and then turn them on to the latest BlackBerry or whatever else we're promoting.
You mentioned the Edelman Trust Barometer earlier. Certainly you've been a leader in studying this phenomenon of trust in global institutions, businesses, and other institutions as well. Can you, and I believe that you began this work roughly around the time of Enron WorldCom.
Yeah, correct.
Can you kind of describe what's happened in the intervening 8 or so years, and what the trends have been since then, and what you see happening in terms of public view of business? And I understand that it varies by location around the world as well.
Well, just to sort of make a general observation, trust in business was affected by Enron, WorldCom, Global Crossing, but it wasn't fundamentally altered. What's happened in the last couple of years is a real reevaluation of the relationship that I, as stakeholder, have with you, business, because again, it was centerpiece companies and also the need for a massive bailout. So the whole theory of kind of Anglo-Saxon deregulation, business will take care of us, whoa, wait a minute, didn't quite work. But I can't count on government because government's proved to be awkward and inept at job creation. We don't believe in that either. So I think people are wary, they're multi-sourcing, they're more self-reliant, but they are really looking for people with specific credentials, whether it's as a friend, because you know Shakespeare, or even more profoundly, I trust a professor from Oxford or something, or even a financial analyst. And this is remarkable. Financial analysts, which you may remember, in 2002 were blamed for the demise of the markets, overhyping. They're now the second most trusted source of information. Interesting. Because Sarbanes-Oxley created that sort of separation between church and state, between iBanking and analysts. And now they're seen as really credible sources. So you can build back. Technology, which was not so high in 2002, has moved to be the #1 trusted industry. Banking, which was the #3 industry only 2 years ago, is now #9. It's just fallen off the cliff. So there is real volatility based on current event. I think banks can re-earn trust, but it's going to be a long, painful process, and it's going to require explanation of how we do what we do. I even think that the sort of phrase proprietary trading is difficult. Proprietary means something unto myself. I'm not sure that that's okay. I have to understand why we're able to be backing up financial institutions as citizens. Why is that good for us?
Yeah.
What do we get in return?
Right. It's the mutuality concept.
Correct.
How can I trust you if my interests and yours are misaligned?
Well, our friend from University of Maryland certainly understood that, our professor friend.
Right.
Mutuality, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and the business model does matter. The public perception of how an industry makes its money.
Yes.
And whether it's heads you win, tails I lose.
Right. Which I'm afraid is the sort of cynical populist approach. But I don't think that there's been a complete flop over to pitchforks and death to business and we want a lot of government, because basically you see sort of underlying aspects of trust in business. 80+% trust in technology. That's indicative. So what is it that the tech industry does that is so magical? Well, they constantly create new products where the price points over time decline. They make my life better. They're an employer of diverse populations. They are wealth creators, meaning the stock prices go up. They have some characters, Sergey Brin, or Jobs, or and they, Gates. Gates has given something back to society that's very important for Microsoft. The Gates Foundation.
Right.
So they're making the world better, is sort of the sense.